2 a.m. my husband secretly copied my credit card details while I was asleep. In the next morning I noticed $500,000 worth of charges on luxury goods and flights to Europe. A week later he returned, flaunting his purchases and saying with a mocking smile, "Thanks for the upgrade," and laughing because the credit card he used. My name is Sarah, and I'm 34 years old. I work in cybersecurity, and for the last 7 years I've been married to a man who turned out to be a walking red flag disguised as charm. Ethan was always the smooth talker, the dreamer, the one who made everything sound like a brilliant plan. Meanwhile, I was the one who made those plans happen, holding down a steady career while he bounced from one half-baked scheme to the next. I ignored the warning signs, the financial secrecy, the constant excuses for his lack of income, because I wanted to believe we were a team. But at 2 a.m. last week, Ethan made a mistake he couldn't charm his way out of. I'd been asleep upstairs when it happened. He must have waited until he was sure I was out cold before sneaking down to my laptop. My cybersecurity work had taught me to keep an eye on potential scams, but I never thought I'd need those skills at home. That night Ethan used my laptop to access one of my credit cards. He copied down the details, snapped a few pictures with his phone, and slinked back into bed like nothing had happened. The next morning, while sipping my coffee, I noticed a flood of alerts on my phone. I opened my banking app to find nearly $50,000 in charges. Designer clothing, expensive watches, 1-stone-class flights to Paris. My stomach sank as the pieces clicked into place. Ethan was behind this. Of course he was. But instead of panicking, I smiled. The card he'd used wasn't a personal account. It was a dummy credit card tied to a training program I run at work. It's designed to teach companies how to detect and respond to fraud. Every transaction triggers an automatic alert that goes straight to the authorities. Ethan had no idea he'd just turned himself into a case study. I called my lawyer Chloe that same morning. "You're not going to believe this," I told her, recounting everything in detail. She didn't even try to hold back her laughter. Wait, let me get this straight," she said between chuckles. "He stole a dummy card? The one that's linked to fraud detection?" "Exactly," I said, my voice calm but edged with satisfaction. "I don't think he realized what he was doing. He probably thought he was being clever." "Clever?" Chloe said. "He's a moron. Every charge he makes is going to get flagged. Have the authorities contacted you yet?" "Not yet, but it's only a matter of time." For the rest of the week I stayed quiet, waiting to see how far Ethan would take it. He left a note on the counter a couple of days later, taking some time for myself. "Don't wait up." I knew exactly what that meant. He was using my stolen money to live it up abroad. Every night I watched the fraud alerts roll in. High-end restaurants, 5-star hotels, and extravagant shopping sprees. Each notification felt like a small victory. 3 days into his spree I got a call from Agent Keller, a federal investigator assigned to the case. "We've identified significant fraudulent activity tied to your account," he said. "Do you know who might be responsible?" "Yes," I replied without hesitation. "My husband." There was a brief pause. "Your husband?" I explained the situation, including the fact that the card was part of a cybersecurity program. Agent Keller let out a low whistle. "That's a new one," he said. "You'll need to provide a formal statement. But based on what we've already flagged, he's in serious trouble." By the time Ethan walked back through the door, his ego inflated from a week of indulgence. I was ready. He sauntered into the living room like nothing had happened, wearing the spoils of his stolen spree. "Thanks for the upgrade," he said with a cocky grin. "You really outdid yourself this time." I couldn't stop the laughter that bubbled out of me. Ethan frowned, clearly expecting me to be furious. "What's so funny?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Oh, Ethan," I said, shaking my head. "You're about to find out." Ethan dropped his designer duffel bag onto the floor with a smug thud. "Seriously though, Sarah," he said, shrugging off his tailored jacket and draping it over the back of the couch. "You should have told me about that card ages ago. Imagine how much fun we could have had." I leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. "And how exactly did you think this was going to end?" He smirked, kicking off his shoes. "You're always so uptight about money. It's not like you couldn't afford it. I figured you'd get over it once you saw how happy it made me." His sheer audacity would have been infuriating if it weren't so pathetic. I bit back a laugh, knowing that every second he spent bragging was another nail in his coffin. "So the watches, the flights, the hotels, you thought all of that was just a gift from me?" "Not thought," he said, pointing at himself. "No, it's about time you loosened up." I smiled, a tight-lipped expression that told him nothing. "I'll bet." Once Ethan disappeared into the shower, humming some obnoxious tune, I picked up my phone and texted Chloe. "He's back, ready to move forward." Her reply was immediate. "Perfect. I'll alert Agent Keller." Over the past week, Chloe and Agent Keller had been preparing the case against Ethan. His every move had been tracked, every charge meticulously logged. From the designer clothing boutiques to the luxury hotels in Paris, his indulgence painted a picture of someone who thought they were untouchable. Ethan had no idea how deep he dug his own grave. Agent Keller had assured me that the fraud alerts from the dummy account had already triggered a full investigation. "We'll bring him in for questioning once you're ready," he'd said during our last call, "but I'd recommend letting him walk into it on his own. The more confident he is, the better." Now as I listened to Ethan's off-key singing echo from the bathroom, I felt an almost surreal sense of calm. For years I'd let him take advantage of my trust, my kindness, my stability. But this time, he was about to face the consequences of underestimating me. After Ethan emerged, wrapped in a plush towel and grinning like he didn't have a care in the world, he flopped onto the couch. "You should have seen Paris," he said, reaching into his bag to pull out a shiny gold watch. The shops, the restaurants, it was like a dream. Sounds incredible, I said, leaning against the doorway. Tell me more. He launched into a detailed account of his week-long spree, complete with exaggerated hand gestures and unnecessary details about the champagne quality at some rooftop bar. Every word felt like an indictment, a confession he didn't even realize he was making. He had no idea I was recording the entire conversation on my phone, the file ready to be forwarded to Agent Keller. And the best part? Ethan said, holding up the watch to admire it. Nobody suspected a thing, not even you. The next morning, Chloe and I met over coffee to finalize the timeline. He's got no defense, she said, scrolling through the evidence we'd compiled. The fraud alerts, the charges, his conversation from last night, it's airtight. Agent Keller is ready to bring him in for questioning. They're coordinating with the local police to execute the arrest. I nodded, the weight of everything finally starting to settle in. What happens after that? He'll face multiple charges including fraud, identity theft, and unauthorized use of a financial account, Chloe explained. Given the amount of money involved, it won't be a slap on the wrist. Best case scenario for him, he cuts a deal and avoids jail time. Worst case, he's looking at years behind bars. A part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, but then I remembered the smug grin on his face, the way he'd flaunted his stolen goods without a second thought about the damage he'd caused. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a pattern of selfishness and entitlement that I'd been blind to for far too long. Later that evening, as Ethan lounged on the couch scrolling through his phone, I heard the unmistakable sound of a knock at the door. My heart raced, not with fear, but with anticipation. I walked to the door and opened it to reveal Agent Keller and two uniformed officers standing on the porch. "Good evening, Miss Miller," Keller said, his tone professional but warm. "Is Ethan home?" "He's right inside," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "Feel free to make yourselves comfortable." Ethan looked up from his phone, his brows knitting together in confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, sitting up straighter. Agent Keller approached him with a calm authority that made the room feel smaller. "Ethan Miller, you're under investigation for multiple counts of credit card fraud and unauthorized use of financial accounts. We'd like you to come with us for questioning." Ethan's face went pale, his confidence evaporating in an instant. "What? No, this has to be a mistake," he stammered, looking to me for support. "Sarah, tell them." "This is crazy." I crossed my arms, tilting my head slightly. "I don't know, Ethan. You've been awfully busy lately. Maybe you should explain it to them." As the officers read him his rights and led him toward the door, Ethan continued to protest. "You can't do this. Sarah, this is a setup. You're my wife. Aren't you supposed to stand by me?" "Funny," I said, leaning against the doorway. "I thought husbands weren't supposed to steal from their wives." "Guess we're both learning something today." Ethan glared at me, his bravado replaced by desperation. "You won't get away with this." I smiled. "Oh, Ethan, I already have." The door shut with a sharp click as the officers escorted Ethan out, leaving the living room eerily silent. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where he'd been standing just minutes ago. My heart was racing, not from fear but from the sheer weight of the moment. He was gone. Finally, undeniably gone. But this wasn't over, not yet. About an hour later, Chloe called. "He's with Agent Keller now," she said, her voice calm but firm. "They've started questioning him. From what Keller told me, Ethan is already trying to spin the story in his favor." "Of course he is," I said, rolling my eyes. "Let me guess. He's playing the victim?" "Spot on," Chloe replied with a dry laugh. "He's claiming you gave him permission to use the card. But don't worry, between the fraud alerts, the charges, and your recording, he doesn't stand a chance." The next morning, Agent Keller called with an update. "We've got everything we need," he said. "Your husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, admitted to using the card, but insists he didn't know it was tied to a fraud detection program. He's trying to blame the mix-up on you." "That sounds about right," I said, leaning back in my chair. "What happens next?" "We're moving forward with the charges," Keller explained. "He's facing multiple counts of fraud and unauthorized use of a financial account. Given the amount of money involved, he'll be looking at significant consequences. The buyer protection programs flagged his luxury purchases, so those are being reimbursed. You're not liable for a cent." The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming. For days I'd carried the weight of Ethan's actions, worried that somehow he'd managed to slip through the cracks. But now, hearing Keller's confidence, I realized the full extent of my victory. "Thank you," I said, "for everything." "Don't thank me," Keller said. "This case practically handed itself to us. You handled this brilliantly." The fallout hit Ethan harder than I expected. Word spread quickly among our mutual friends and acquaintances about his arrest, and it wasn't long before his carefully crafted image of the charming, carefree husband began to crumble. Nicole, the woman I suspected he'd been seeing, apparently dropped him the moment she heard about the charges. The designer goods he'd flaunted were confiscated. The flights he'd booked were canceled, and the banks froze his accounts. One evening, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered, and sure enough it was Ethan. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and strained. I need to talk to you." I couldn't help but laugh. "Ethan, the only thing you need to do is figure out how to explain yourself to the judge?" "Please," he said, his tone shifting to desperation. "I messed up, okay? I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just what?" I interrupted, my voice cold. "Just trying to steal $50,000 from me? Just hoping I wouldn't notice? Just banking on me being too blind or too forgiving to stop you?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally he muttered, "I thought you loved me." I let out a sharp breath, my anger boiling over. "I did, Ethan. I loved the person I thought you were. But the person who stole from me, who lied to me, who thought he could get away with it, that's not someone I could ever love. Before he could respond, I hung up. A week later, Chloe called to confirm that Ethan had accepted a plea deal. He's avoiding jail time, she explained, but he'll have to pay back every cent he tried to steal and complete community service. Plus, his credit is going to be in shambles for years. That sounds fitting, I said. He always wanted the high life. Now he gets to see how the other half lives. Chloe laughed. You're handling this way better than most people would. It's funny, I said, smiling to myself. For years I thought Ethan was the one who held things together in our marriage. I thought his charm, his ambition, his big ideas were what kept us moving forward, but now I see it clearly. I was the one holding everything up. He was just dead weight. The day the divorce papers came through, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch, looking around the apartment that now felt wholly and completely mine. Ethan's absence wasn't a loss. It was a gift, a chance to rebuild my life without the constant shadow of his selfishness. As I sipped my wine, I thought about the moment he'd walked through the door, flaunting his stolen goods and mocking me for the supposed upgrade he'd given himself. He'd been so confident, so sure of his own brilliance, and now he was the one paying the price. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of a life I could finally call my own. The apartment felt eerily quiet in the days after Ethan's arrest. His things were gone, what little he hadn't sold or stuffed into his designer duffel bag, but the space felt lighter, almost like the weight of his betrayal had been physically lifted. For the first time in years, I could sit in my own home without feeling his shadow looming over me. Chloe stopped by one afternoon to drop off some final paperwork. How are you holding up, she asked, sitting on the couch with her usual no-nonsense demeanor. Better than I thought I would, I admitted, handing her a cup of coffee. It's strange, but I don't even feel angry anymore, just relieved. She smiled knowingly. That's because you've already won. You didn't just survive this, Sarah. You came out stronger. Yeah. I thought about that as we went through the documents finalizing the details of Ethan's financial restitution. It wasn't just about the money, though knowing he'd be paying back every cent was satisfying. It was about finally reclaiming my independence. For years I'd let Ethan dictate the terms of our relationship, thinking it was easier to keep the peace. But now, I realized that peace built on compromise and silence wasn't peace at all. The official letter of divorce arrived a week later, delivered in an unassuming envelope that felt far too small to contain something so monumental. I held it for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in before tearing it open. My eyes scanned the lines of legal jargon until I found the words that mattered most. Finalized and irrevocable. I sat down at the kitchen table, the letter in my hands, and allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. This wasn't the life I'd imagined when I married Ethan. I'd pictured stability, partnership, and a future built on mutual trust, but now as I looked around the home I'd rebuilt for myself, I realized I had something better. Freedom, clarity, and the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever given myself credit for. Lauren came over that evening with a bottle of wine and a carton of my favorite takeout. To new beginnings, she said, raising her glass, and to the absolute dumpster fire you just walked away from. I laughed, clinking my glass against hers, to never settling for less than I deserve. Over the next few weeks, I started to piece together what my new life would look like. I redecorated the apartment, adding splashes of color and personal touches that felt like me. I finally took the solo vacation I'd been dreaming about for years, exploring the coast and soaking in the kind of peace that only comes from leaving everything behind for a little while. Ethan tried to reach out a few more times through mutual acquaintances, vague apologies over email, even a laughably tone-deaf letter claiming he'd changed. But I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He'd made his choices and I'd made mine. Every now and then, I'd hear updates about his life through the grapevine. He was struggling to find work, his reputation tarnished by the fraud charges. He'd moved back in with his parents, apparently still clinging to the belief that he could talk his way out of anything. I didn't feel sorry for him. If anything, I felt relief. He wasn't my problem anymore. A month after everything had been finalized, I stood by the window of my apartment, sipping my morning coffee and watching the city come to life below. The sunlight poured into the living room, highlighting the fresh coat of paint I'd picked out, my favorite shade of blue. The space no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like home. It was peaceful, mine, and filled with possibilities. I thought about the journey that had brought me here. For years, I'd believed in the promise of marriage, in the idea of building a life with Ethan. I'd ignored the little voice inside me that whispered something was off, that warned me his charm was a mask for selfishness. But now I understood something important. Walking away wasn't failure, it was strength. Lauren and I met for brunch that weekend, a new ritual we'd started since Ethan's exit. Over mimosas and waffles, she asked, "So what's next for you?" I smiled, feeling a mix of excitement and calm that had eluded me for so long. Honestly, I'm just focusing on myself for now. Work's going great, and I've been thinking about taking a longer vacation, maybe somewhere quiet near the mountains. She raised her glass. That's what I like to hear. You deserve it. For the first time in years, I felt like I was making decisions purely for me. No compromises, no second guessing, just the freedom to live on my own terms. Occasionally, I'd still get updates about Ethan from mutual acquaintances. He was struggling to rebuild his life, moving from one low-paying job to the next while trying to pay back the money he owed. The designer suits and luxury trips were long gone, replaced by a harsh reality he wasn't prepared for. I didn't dwell on it. He'd made his choices, and I'd made mine. The last time I heard from him was through an email, a long rambling apology that seemed more self-pitying than sincere. I read the first few lines before deleting it without a reply. I didn't need closure from him. I'd already found it in myself. One evening, I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine, reflecting on everything I'd been through. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the fight to reclaim what was mine, it had all led to this moment. And while it hadn't been easy, it had been worth it. I no longer felt angry or bitter about what had happened. If anything, I felt grateful. Ethan's betrayal had forced me to confront my own strength, to stop compromising and start prioritizing myself. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to value my independence, and to never again let someone else take the reins of my life. As the city lights flickered in the distance, I raised my glass to the night sky. "Here's to me," I said quietly. "Here's to starting over." And with that I closed the chapter on Ethan for good, ready to embrace whatever came next.